Before we get into the military civil conflict within Sudan that has developed over the few weeks, we must firstly travel back in time, back to the time of longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir, who came to power in 1989 in the then largest nation in Africa. In 2011, Sudan was split into two when South Sudan voted in a peaceful election to split from its northern counterpart, which retained the name Sudan. It is in this, the northern half of Sudan, simply known now as Sudan, where we now witness the conflicts taking place. In late 2020, Russia and Sudan agreed to establish a Russian naval base at Port Sudan, a naval base that would also host up to 300 military Russian personnel, naval ships, and most importantly, nuclear-powered vessels. On discovering this and fearing that their influence would dwindle in the region and also the threat of a Russian military presence within the Sudanese Red Sea coast, U.S. Ambassador to Sudan warned Sudan against accepting this deal with Russia, saying, quote, "The deal would isolate Sudan from the international community and undermine the country's interests." They offered American assistance instead to help form a civilian-led government, but the Sudanese finalized the deal anyway, despite threats from the U.S., which was a blatant interference in Sudanese domestic affairs. It was then after the two functions of the Sudanese military split up and started fighting against each other, made up of Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, head of the paramilitary group known as Rapid Support Forces, RSF. The other function is led by Sudanese Army Chief General Abdel. This conflict was inspired by a tug of war for the Sudanese Red Sea coast that led Russia and US, just like in the 80s during the Cold War, to fight a proxy war where African blood is shed instead of theirs. A proxy war is an armed conflict between two nations where those two nations are not directly involved in the hostilities. This is what is happening in Sudan right now. The Sudanese conflict is not a war simply for power between the two Sudanese factions, but control over Sudan by Russia on one side and the US on the other. That is why Russia is providing arms to one side, while the US has military presence in the area to ward off Russian influence. Another war for profit, for everyone except those dying in the front lines. Another war between superpowers fought within a third world, resource-rich nation. Another war that the mainstream media will lie to you about.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."